Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It started as an ordinary day, as most unsettling things do. My girlfriend, Anna, and I decided to take a stroll in the park. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind that makes you forget time as you wander between trees and paths, under a sun just starting to dip low. We had our camera, the old one we used for impromptu photo sessions, capturing moments just for ourselves. We didn't think much of it when we found a quiet corner by the lake. The autumn leaves had begun to fall, creating a perfect canvas of oranges and reds. It was beautiful, tranquil, and we were enjoying the simple joy of being together, laughing at the camera's awkward angles and the odd poses we struck. Anna took the first picture, just a quick shot of me sitting by the lake, smiling. She always liked candid shots, ones that didn't look too posed. After a few more pictures, we packed up and headed back home, tired but content. Later, that evening, we developed the film. We had taken the rolls to the local shop, eager to see what we had captured. As the photos began to appear, I noticed something strange in the first few shots. In every picture, there was an empty space. An area where nothing stood. No trees. No people. Just nothing. I flipped through the pictures. There I was, sitting on the edge of the lake. But beside me, nothing. No Anna. She had disappeared from every single shot. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned. But no! The pictures were clear, the background fine. It was as if she had never been there. Anna, come here, I called, my voice rising slightly with confusion. She walked over, curious. What's wrong? She asked, peering over my shoulder. Her eyes widened when she saw the photos. That's not possible, she whispered. Anna had been with me the entire time. I could clearly remember her laughing just before I took each shot, and I had even seen her standing beside me, just a few feet away. But now, there was no sign of her. It was like she had been erased. We sat in silence for a while, staring at the photographs. The room seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with unease. My mind raced. Was it some trick of the light? Was it possible that the pictures had been somehow corrupted? I don't know, Anna said, shaking her head. This doesn't make any sense. I tried to calm her down, even though I wasn't sure how to explain what was happening. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion or a technical glitch, I reasoned. But deep inside, I felt an unsettling sense that something else was at play, something I couldn't understand. As the evening wore on, I tried to focus on something else, anything else. But the photographs lay there, their empty spaces haunting me. There was a silence between Anna and me that night, one that I couldn't shake. And that silence continued to grow the longer I stared at the pictures. The following week, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it was just a fluke, that maybe we had misremembered something about the day. We had taken so many photos over the years, it was possible to forget one or two details. But as I went about my daily routine, the strange feeling lingered, an unshakable sense that something was wrong. Anna and I hadn't spoken much about the photos after that night. She seemed to dismiss it, brushing it off as a weird glitch, but I could see the flicker of concern behind her eyes whenever I brought it up. She wasn't convinced either. Neither of us was. The unease began to creep back when we decided to go for another walk in the park. We tried to act normal, even joked around as we made our way down the same path where we had taken the first set of photos. But it wasn't the same. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see something, anything, that would explain what had happened to the pictures. When we reached the lake, I stopped and looked at the spot where we had sat before. It was the same, but it felt different. Like something was watching us. "Let's take another photo," Anna suggested, almost too casually. But I could tell she was nervous, too. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was hoping to prove. I didn't want to bring it up again, but I needed to know if the strange emptiness in the photos would happen again. We set the camera up and posed the way we had the week before. This time, I was more aware of every sound, every movement around us. My fingers trembled as I pressed the shutter. Afterward, we walked back home in silence. It was only when we were home, going through the pictures once again, that my stomach dropped. The first photo we took had the same disturbing result. Anna was gone. The empty space was back. I felt a chill run down my spine as I flicked through the rest of the photos. One by one, they all had the same thing, nothing where she should have been. It wasn't just a missing person in a frame. It was as if she had never been there to begin with. The emptiness was absolute, like the universe had simply erased her presence. I couldn't breathe. "This is impossible," I muttered, more to myself than Anna. She was standing behind me, her face pale as she stared at the images. "I don't know what to think anymore. I can't explain it." I turned around to face her, my heart pounding. But it's happening again. It's like she's been erased from reality. And it's not just the pictures. It's like I can't remember the exact moments when she was standing next to me. It's like she was never there. Anna didn't respond. She looked down at the photographs, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the empty spaces. I saw the worry creep into her eyes, and it mirrored my own growing fear. "Maybe we should talk to someone," I said, trying to sound calm, but my voice wavered. Maybe it's time to figure out what's happening here." But even as I spoke, something inside me, something deep in my gut, told me that this wasn't something we could explain away. And the more I stared at those photos, the more I realized I wasn't just scared of the pictures anymore. I was scared of the thing that was slowly erasing Anna from my life. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Anna's face, or rather, the absence of it. It wasn't just in the photos. It was in my memory, too. I tried to think back to the moments we had shared, but the details felt fuzzy, like they were slipping through my fingers. I could no longer remember the way her hair fell over her shoulder when she smiled or the warmth of her hand in mine as we walked. All I could remember was that hollow space where she should have been. By the next morning, I was desperate. I decided to go back to the park, alone this time. I needed answers, even if they were terrifying. The park was eerily quiet when I arrived. The usual chatter of joggers and children playing was absent. Only the wind rustled the leaves on the trees, and even that sounded wrong, too sharp, too purposeful, like it was trying to tell me something. I walked to the same spot where we had taken the photos. It was exactly the same as it had been the week before. But the sense of dread that had settled in my chest was overwhelming. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the empty space where Anna and I had posed. The emptiness seemed to stretch, as if mocking me, daring me to figure it out. I decided to take another photo, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to take several tries to get the camera set up properly. As I posed and pressed the button, a cold chill crept up my spine. I didn't know why I was so sure, but I felt something watching me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. When the photo printed out later, I didn't even need to look at it to know what I would see. Once again, the space next to me was empty. But this time, the effect wasn't confined to just one photo. The entire roll of film was the same. Every single image was incomplete. Not one shot had both of us in it. Anna had vanished from each one, leaving only a strange distortion in the frames where she should have been. I felt nauseous, the weight of the realization hitting me like a physical blow. This wasn't just an unusual glitch. This was something worse. I tried calling Anna, but she didn't answer. I left frantic messages on her voicemail, my voice rising with each one. But there was no response. It was as if she was disappearing from my life in ways that went beyond photos. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her not just physically, but from existence itself. And the more I tried to piece together the truth, the more fractured and distorted the world around me became. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to confront the thing that was taking her from me. I rushed over to her apartment, heart pounding in my chest. I had to know where she was, why she wasn't answering, and what had happened to her. But when I arrived, the door was unlocked. The apartment was dark and silent. I called her name, but there was no response. The place was completely still, except for one thing. The photographs on the walls. All of them were normal, except for one. A recent picture of the two of us, framed on the coffee table. The space where Anna should have been was empty. It wasn't just a picture. It was real. The absence in the photo felt alive. It felt like it was sucking everything around it into the void. A loud sound broke my thoughts, something scraping behind me. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around. The air seemed to shift, thickening with an unseen presence. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, soft at first, but unmistakable. "Leave, now!" I froze, my pulse racing. The whisper wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from somewhere else. My hand shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed Anna's number again. No answer. But then the whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Leave her. Let go." The voice was unmistakably Anna's. I couldn't move. The whisper, her voice, was like a ghost echoing in my head. I spun in circles, desperately trying to locate the source of the sound, but the room remained just as silent, the same dark corners and familiar furniture mocking my search. "Anna?" My voice trembled, barely a whisper in the overwhelming silence. "Anna, where are you? What's happening?" The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive quiet in its wake. I stood there, my breath ragged, feeling the cold air press against me like a thick, invisible wall. A part of me wanted to run, to leave this place and never look back, but another part, an instinctual, primal part, told me to stay. I had to know the truth. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the apartment one more time. The photos on the walls, the strange feeling that had settled over everything, none of it made sense. My mind was a storm of questions, of doubts, of fears I couldn't understand. As I moved toward the table with the framed picture of Anna and me, my phone rang. The sudden sound startled me, and I nearly dropped it. I looked at the screen, Anna's name was flashing. I answered quickly, nearly breathless. Anna? Where are you? What's going on? For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. And then, a faint, crackling sound. And then her voice. But it wasn't Anna. Don't come back here, the voice said, a distorted version of her tone. It was wrong. Cold and mechanical, as though every word had been twisted. Leave now. It's too late. I gripped the phone tightly, panic rising in my chest. What do you mean? Where are you? I'm right here, Anna. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, heart racing. My hands shook as I tried to process what had just happened. That wasn't Anna's voice. It was something else. Something that wasn't quite human. My stomach churned as a wave of realization crashed over me. It was as if she wasn't the one calling. But who or what was? I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I needed to leave. I had to get out of here before whatever was happening consumed me too. But then something caught my eye. The photo on the coffee table, the one where Anna had been, was now turned around. I hadn't touched it. I never moved it from its spot. My pulse quickened as I slowly approached, my hand trembling as I picked it up. And then I saw it. In the place where Anna's face should have been was an empty space. But it wasn't just blank. It was as if the frame was pulling at the edges, distorting the air around it. Something wasn't right. I leaned in closer. The photo shimmered, flickering like a broken television screen. For a split second, I thought I saw something, someone standing just beyond the photo's edge. But it was gone before I could focus on it. A shadow passed behind me. The temperature dropped, the air thick and suffocating. My body froze, my breath catching in my throat as I turned slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And there she was. Anna. But not the Anna I knew. Her form was distorted, stretched out of shape, like a puppet with its strings cut. Her eyes were wide and hollow, staring at me without recognition. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her body twitched unnaturally as though she was caught between two worlds. I wanted to scream, to run, to break free from this nightmare, but my body wouldn't move. You should have left, she whispered, her voice low and guttural. It wasn't her voice at all, it was the same mechanical, distorted tone that had spoken to me on the phone. The photo she had been in, the one that had taken her from me, began to warp, stretching outward like a tear in the fabric of reality itself. The edges were curling inwards, as if the very concept of her existence was being erased. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, my mind racing. What is happening to her? You can't save her now, the voice hissed. It was no longer Anna's voice at all. You were never meant to be together. With a final, guttural screech, Anna's form twisted into an unrecognizable blur. In the space where she had been standing, a void opened up, dark and endless. The room seemed to collapse inward, and the shadows twisted and writhed as if they were alive, reaching for me, pulling me into the abyss. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the whispers growing louder, circling around me like a storm, distorting everything I knew. The walls closed in as I fled through the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. But no matter how fast I ran, the darkness seemed to follow. And then, in the final moment, I understood. The photos, the calls, Anna's disappearance, it was all a lie. A trick. A trap. Something had stolen her from me, and now it was coming for me too. With a scream, I slammed the door behind me, the air thick with a cold, unnatural silence. But I knew. I had seen the truth, and the truth was this: once you're caught in this place, you're never truly free. The air in the hallway was still. The silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating, as I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each beat loud in my ears. I couldn't think straight. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened, what was happening. The photo. Anna. The voice. The darkness. It all felt like a nightmare, but it was real. Too real. I turned to face the hallway, desperate to understand what was going on, but the walls seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, a maze with no exit. My hands shook as I clutched the photo of Anna, the real Anna, from earlier. Her smile, so warm, so familiar. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was staring me in the face. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A faint thud, like something heavy being dropped on the floor. It came from the living room, the direction I had just fled from. My blood ran cold. I knew I should stay put. I knew I shouldn't go back, but the pull was too strong. The compulsion to see it through, to understand what was happening, was overwhelming. I took a deep breath and pushed myself off the door. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I took one shaky step forward, then another, toward the living room. The floorboards creaked under my feet, each sound amplified in the tense quiet. I passed through the hallway, the dim lights flickering overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. My breath felt shallow, the atmosphere oppressive, like I was walking through a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. As I stepped into the living room, my eyes immediately fell on the table where the photo had been. It was gone. I knew it hadn't been taken by me. The place where it had been was now empty, the frame left behind, abandoned. But then something moved in the corner of my eye. I turned my head slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There, in the dim light, was a figure standing by the window. The room was still, so still, but there was someone there. No, not someone. Something. Its form was distorted, as if it didn't belong here. The edges of its body flickered, like a corrupted image on a screen. And then I heard it. The whisper. That same voice, distorted and garbled, but unmistakably Anna's. I never left. The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I backed away, my hands trembling as I gripped the doorframe for support. My mind screamed for me to turn and run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the very air around me was holding me in place. You're too late, the voice continued, now more guttural, more insistent. You were never meant to see the truth. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the room itself was closing in on me, the walls pressing against me, suffocating me. I looked back at the shadowy figure. It was Anna, or what was left of her. Her face was twisted, her features stretched beyond recognition. Her mouth moved, but the sound wasn't right. It was like 1,000 voices blended into one, whispering, calling to me. We were never real, it whispered. None of it was real. And then, in an instant, the air grew cold. The room darkened, the shadows stretching and warping around me, folding in on themselves. The edges of reality began to blur. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my mind unraveling, the world around me becoming nothing more than a chaotic, distorted nightmare. The shadows seemed to move toward me, pulling me into the darkness, erasing everything I had known. I had to escape. I had to wake up. But it was too late. The figure, Anna, reached out to me with its distorted hand. The moment it touched me, everything went black. There was no sound, no light. Just emptiness. And then, nothing. The next time I opened my eyes, I was back at the park. The warm sun was shining overhead, and people were laughing, walking, going about their day. It was peaceful. Normal. But something was wrong. It felt wrong. I looked around, my chest tightening, my heart racing. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out, my hands trembling. The screen was cracked, the edges frayed, but there was a new notification, an image. A photo. I opened it slowly, my eyes widening in disbelief. It was a photo of Anna and me, taken that very day. But something was off. In the photo, Anna was smiling, but in the space next to her, where I should have been, there was only an empty space. No person. Just an empty void. My fingers shook as I dropped the phone, the screen cracking as it hit the ground. I was gone. Erased. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her again, Anna. But this time, she wasn't distorted. She was normal. She smiled at me, but it wasn't her smile. It was something else. And I knew. I knew the truth now. I was never meant to be here. I was never meant to be a part of this world. And now, I was just another ghost in the frame. Every morning began the same way. I'd wake up to the sound of the world outside, distant cars, the faint hum of voices from the street below. But something was always slightly off. A subtle discomfort that I couldn't quite place. It was never enough to make me question my surroundings, just enough to make me feel watched. I lived alone in a small apartment on the 5th floor of a nondescript building. The kind of place that blended in with the rest of the city, unnoticed, unremarkable. I worked from home, so the days usually passed in a haze of monotony, emails, phone calls, the occasional walk to the grocery store. My life was simple, orderly, routine. Or, at least, it used to be. It was the mornings that started to feel different, one day after another. The first time it happened, I thought it was a mistake, a coincidence, maybe even something I'd overlooked. But when I found the note again the next morning, my unease grew. I didn't know when exactly it started. Perhaps a week ago. But now it was every day. A small, folded piece of paper placed neatly under my door. The first time I saw it, I picked it up and stared at it for a moment, unsure of what I was holding. The handwriting was neat, almost childishly precise. There were no other markings, no name or address, just a simple sentence. You seemed tired yesterday. I frowned at the note, puzzled. How could someone know that? It was true. I had been tired, drained from work and a restless night, but I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't even mentioned it to myself. I brushed it off as a fluke. Maybe one of my neighbors, someone who had seen me walk past, had left it as a strange form of friendly observation. After all, it wasn't threatening, just a comment. But the next morning, there was another note. You didn't eat lunch yesterday. I stood frozen, staring at the paper. This was no longer a coincidence. There was something unsettling about it now. How could someone know this? I hadn't told anyone I'd skipped lunch. I hadn't even noticed I'd skipped it. But there it was, another observation, another piece of my private life laid bare. It was only the beginning. The next few days, the notes became more specific, more intimate. You left your phone on the table last night. I saw you checking the time at exactly 7:23. I noticed you looking out the window, wondering if you'd see someone walking by. I hadn't mentioned any of these things to anyone. No one had been in my apartment. I hadn't spoken to anyone who could have known these details. And yet, each morning, the notes seemed to get closer, more personal. As if whoever was leaving them had been with me, watching me every moment. The weight of it began to press on me. My apartment, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me. My own home, where I should have been safe, now felt unfamiliar. Like someone was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. Who was doing this? The sound of the elevator dinging startled me one afternoon. I had been so lost in my thoughts, pacing the living room, trying to make sense of it all. I rushed to the door, half expecting to see another note on the ground. But there was nothing. I exhaled in relief, though it didn't last long. The quiet felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That somehow, someone was just beyond my reach, always present. It wasn't until the fifth note that the real terror set in. I know what you're thinking right now. The handwriting was the same, but the words, those words made my stomach churn. They were too precise. Too accurate. How could someone know what I was thinking in that exact moment? I hadn't said a word. I hadn't shared anything with anyone. But there it was. The note. My thoughts laid out in front of me. I had to confront it. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood at the door, staring at the note, the darkness of the apartment behind me pressing in like a suffocating fog. There was only one thing I could do. I had to find out who was doing this. But I had no idea where to start. Was it a neighbor? Was it someone I knew? Or was it someone else entirely, someone who had been watching me for a lot longer than I realized? I thought about the security cameras, the ones that covered the hallways and stairwells. Maybe I could find something there. But as I moved toward the hallway, the unsettling thought came to mind. What if the cameras had been tampered with? What if the person who left the notes had already thought of that? And then the real horror hit me. What if I was being watched right now? I turned quickly, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the oppressive silence. I needed answers. And I was running out of time. I couldn't shake the thought. What if I was being watched right now? The question spun in my mind like a broken record, refusing to let go. I turned around once more, my eyes darting over every corner of the room, as if expecting someone to step out from behind the curtains or leap out of the closet. But there was nothing except the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the old wooden floors beneath my feet. I stepped away from the door and toward the hallway. The dim light from the ceiling cast long shadows against the walls, and the sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. I reached the small security camera above the door to my apartment. It was positioned perfectly to capture anyone entering or leaving, but its blinking red light told me that it was working. I stared at it, as if daring it to give me an answer. But nothing came. The camera, like everything else in this apartment, was empty. I felt my heart race as I thought back to the notes, the unnerving observations. It wasn't just the things I noticed, It was the details I hadn't realized anyone could see. Like the exact time I checked the clock or the way I'd absentmindedly brushed my hair behind my ear. The words had been so precise, so unnervingly accurate. Someone knew everything. I pushed open the door to the small storage closet in the hallway, hoping for some sort of clue, anything that could explain this madness. But it was as I suspected. Nothing. Just old cleaning supplies, a forgotten umbrella, and an empty cardboard box. I slammed the door shut in frustration, my breath shallow. I turned back to my apartment, the note still in my hand. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was one of my neighbors, someone who lived a few doors down. Could they have been watching me through the peephole? It was a chilling thought, but not impossible. But the notes weren't just observations, they were too personal. Too specific. They were getting closer, in a way that made me feel suffocated. The next step seemed inevitable. I needed to know who had been in my apartment. I needed to find the security footage from the hallway. It was my best chance to catch whoever was behind this. But something stopped me cold as I reached for my phone. A thought, sharp and intrusive, ran through my mind. What if the person behind the notes already knew I would check the cameras? I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the creeping paranoia. I couldn't let myself think like that. I had to take action. I couldn't just sit here and let someone invade my life like this. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door, determined to find the building's management office. The air outside was crisp, biting at my face as I hurried down the street. It felt good to be out, to have a sense of control, even if just for a moment. The world beyond the walls of my apartment seemed so far away, so normal. But I couldn't escape the nagging sense of being followed. As I rounded the corner to the building's entrance, I almost bumped into someone walking out. It was an older man, a neighbor from a few floors down. He smiled at me and tipped his hat, his face warm with familiarity. But as I looked into his eyes, a chill ran down my spine. There was something there, something I couldn't place. He paused for a second, his gaze lingering on me, before he nodded and walked away. I quickly brushed it off as my imagination running wild. But my feet felt heavy as I entered the building. The elevators were empty, and I pressed the button to head down to the lobby. My mind churned with 1,000 thoughts, all of them leading me back to the same unsettling conclusion: someone was watching me. When I arrived in the management office, the small space was cramped, with a desk stacked high with paperwork and a single computer that hummed quietly in the corner. The manager, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, glanced up as I entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, almost uninterested. "I need to see the security footage from my floor," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something strange happening. I think someone's been in my apartment." She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze narrowing slightly. "That's quite a claim," she said, her tone skeptical. "We don't typically share footage like that unless there's an official request." "I'm making an official request," I insisted. "I've been finding notes outside my door, notes that have details about my day. Someone is clearly watching me." Her expression shifted, and she finally sighed, standing up from her desk. "All right. But you'll need to fill out a form. It'll take a couple of days to process." "I don't have a couple of days," I said quickly, feeling the urgency in my chest. "Please, I need it now." She paused, eyes softening slightly. "You're sure about this? You're sure no one else has access to your apartment?" I hesitated. "Yes. No one has been in there." She nodded slowly and turned to the computer. After a few moments of typing, she clicked a button and turned back to me. "I've made a request for the footage. It should be available in a few hours. You can come back then." I wasn't sure if I could wait that long. I nodded stiffly and left the office, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me even more. As I stood in the lobby, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my best friend, Lily, asking if I wanted to grab dinner later. I stared at the message for a moment, trying to force my mind to focus on something else. But before I could respond, a strange feeling settled over me. The same feeling I had earlier, the feeling of being watched. I turned around abruptly, scanning the lobby. No one seemed out of place, but I felt that familiar prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I quickly typed a short reply to Lily and then stepped outside, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The silence of the street seemed almost oppressive as I walked home, the world around me blurring into a haze. I couldn't shake the thought that the notes were only the beginning, that the real horror was yet to come. And then, as I reached my apartment building, I saw it. Another note. I froze, standing just outside my door. The note sat there, innocently placed under the crack. It was like a twisted routine now, a daily event that was beginning to feel like an invasion I couldn't escape. I hadn't even made it inside yet, and there it was, waiting for me, as if it had always belonged there. My hands trembled as I crouched down, reaching for the folded paper. I hesitated for a moment, dread curling in my stomach. What would it say this time? Was I being followed, or was it something worse? I unfolded the note slowly. My eyes skimmed over the familiar handwriting, and my breath hitched when I saw the first sentence. "You walked to the management office today. You seemed anxious." My pulse raced, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. How did they know that? I hadn't told anyone what I was doing. No one except the manager had seen me. And even if they had, how could they know what I was feeling? The next line sent a jolt through my body. "You looked over your shoulder when you walked out of the building, as though expecting someone." I gripped the note tighter, my mind spiraling. Every detail in the note matched my actions perfectly, down to the smallest movements I had thought were so insignificant. This wasn't just someone watching me. This was someone who knew me better than I knew myself. Someone who was waiting, observing, cataloging every moment. I read the next line. "You didn't see him, did you? He was standing by the door when you left. He always watches from the shadows." My throat went dry. I had thought I saw something earlier, in the lobby, a strange feeling when I bumped into the old man, the way his eyes lingered on me. My mind tried to rationalize it. He was just a neighbor. But now, reading those words, it felt like my thoughts had been exposed, stripped of every defense. I hadn't imagined it. I backed away from the door, almost stumbling as I turned. The hallway felt too narrow now, as if it was closing in around me. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before whatever this was consumed me. But then I stopped, my hand resting on the doorknob. The note was still clenched in my fist, and for the first time, I realized something terrifying. Whoever had been leaving these notes, whoever had been following me, was closer than I had ever imagined. They weren't just watching from the outside, they were inside my life, inside my thoughts. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. The notes weren't just a warning, they were a countdown. Someone was drawing closer with each passing moment. I turned the knob and stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me with a hollow sound. The apartment felt quieter than usual, the silence pressing down on me as I moved toward the living room. My eyes darted around, instinctively scanning every corner, every shadow. The air felt thicker now, almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I thought about the camera footage. The manager had promised I could see it later, but I didn't know if I could wait that long. What if the footage revealed something, someone who had been in my apartment while I was gone? I grabbed my phone from the table, dialing the manager's number. It rang, and I anxiously chewed on my lip, waiting for her to pick up. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching into eternity. Finally, she answered, her voice a little less pleasant than before. "Hello? I need the footage now," I said, my voice tight. "I can't wait any longer." There was a brief silence on the other end. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to wait until tomorrow. We're not able to expedite requests. It's policy." "Policy?" I snapped, panic creeping into my voice. "I'm telling you, someone is watching me, someone who knows everything about my day. I need that footage right now. Please." Her tone softened, but only slightly. "I understand you're scared, but there's nothing I can do about it. You'll get the footage in a few hours. Just try to stay calm." Stay calm? How could I stay calm when every breath felt like I was suffocating under a weight I couldn't escape? I hung up, the phone dropping limply in my hand. The reality of my situation set in like a thick fog. I had no way of proving what I was feeling. No way to convince anyone that my life was slipping through my fingers, one detail at a time. Suddenly, I felt it, the unmistakable sense of being watched. It crept up my spine like an invisible hand, and I froze. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see it. Then, a soft sound, almost imperceptible, caught my ear. It was a whisper, faint but clear. I knew that voice. My heart stopped. It was my own voice. "You're not alone." I whirled around, my eyes wild, searching the room, but there was nothing, no one. The silence that followed was deafening. My pulse thundered in my ears. My breath came in short, frantic gasps as I turned slowly, scanning the room with frantic eyes. Nothing. No one. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The whisper, it had come from inside my own head. But it had been too clear, too real, to be a figment of my imagination. I staggered back toward the couch, my legs unsteady, and collapsed onto it, my mind racing. Had I heard it wrong? Was it the stress, the constant tension building up in my chest, causing me to hallucinate? But deep down, I knew better. The whisper had been real. I wasn't alone in this apartment. I wasn't alone anywhere. I grabbed the note again, my hand shaking violently as I read it one more time. The words were the same as before, detailing my every move. But now, they felt like a taunt. Whoever was behind this wasn't just observing me, they were toying with me, playing some kind of sick game. "You went to the store today. You didn't notice the man in the blue coat staring at you from the corner. He followed you home. You didn't see him, but he's still close." I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The man in the blue coat. My mind flashed back to the short trip I had made to the grocery store earlier that day. I had seen him, sort of. A man, standing off to the side, watching the street. But I hadn't paid him much attention. Now, reading those words, the truth hit me with terrifying clarity. The man had been following me, and I hadn't even noticed. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady my breath. I needed to think. I needed to act. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait for the footage. I had to take control of this situation before it completely consumed me. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair and rushed to the door, hesitating only for a moment before stepping out into the hallway. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as if something was about to happen. The silence that enveloped the building was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime as I stepped inside. I pushed the button for the lobby, my fingers trembling as they hovered over the panel. The elevator descended slowly, each floor passing with agonizing slowness. My mind raced, imagining every possible scenario. What if the man in the blue coat was waiting for me downstairs? What if he was already in the building? The doors slid open with a soft, metallic sound. The lobby was empty. Not a single soul in sight. But the unease only deepened as I stepped out. The stillness was almost unnatural, like the calm before a storm. I moved quickly toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of the building, but something kept me anchored. A force, a pull, something invisible but all-consuming. I paused just before the door, my hand on the handle. Something, some instinct, told me to look back. I turned. And there, in the far corner of the lobby, I saw him. The man in the blue coat. He was standing by the window, his face hidden in the shadows. He was looking directly at me. But this time, I saw him. This time, I didn't have to guess. His eyes were locked on mine, a chilling intensity in his gaze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Was he the one leaving the notes? I took a hesitant step back, but he didn't move. He just stood there, silent, watching me. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen in place. It was like time had stopped, like the whole world was holding its breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and quiet, but carrying through the stillness of the lobby. "You've been looking for me." The words sent a shock through my body. I took another step back, my heart racing, and that's when I heard it, the faintest sound. A soft click, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat, only to see the elevator doors slowly closing behind me. I hadn't seen anyone get out. The elevator hadn't stopped on any of the floors. But someone had been there. Someone had been inside the elevator. I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I bolted for the exit, ignoring the voice calling after me, the man's words still echoing in my mind. "You've been looking for me." I reached the door, pushing it open with all my strength, and stumbled out into the night. The cool air hit my face, but it did nothing to calm the panic rising in my chest. I stood there, in the middle of the street, trying to gather my thoughts. The world around me was quiet, too quiet, as if the whole city was holding its breath. My hands trembled at my sides, and I stared at the note crumpled in my hand. "He's waiting for you." I couldn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't. But where else could I go? I couldn't run forever. I heard a faint sound behind me, footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. I turned around slowly, my breath catching. And there, at the corner of the street, was the man in the blue coat, standing in the shadows. He wasn't just watching me anymore. He was waiting. And I had no idea how much longer I could keep running. I froze. The man in the blue coat was standing there, at the edge of the streetlight's glow, just out of reach of the full light. He didn't move, but his presence was more unsettling than anything I'd felt before. It was like he was waiting for something, or someone. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't just stand here, I knew that. But I couldn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't risk going back to that place where I'd seen him in the lobby, watching me. He was already too close, too aware of my every move. I started to walk away, my steps unsure at first, but gaining speed as panic set in. The world around me felt distorted, like everything had become just a little too bright or a little too quiet. My mind kept repeating his words, "You've been looking for me." He had known. He had always known. And now, he was getting closer. I could hear his footsteps behind me, soft at first, then growing louder with each step I took. They echoed in my ears, matching the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. I glanced over my shoulder. He hadn't moved. Was he really following me, or was I just imagining it? The street felt endless, like it stretched on forever in both directions, and I was running nowhere. My breath was coming in sharp, ragged gasps. I had to get away. I had to think. And then it hit me. The elevator. The note. It was all connected. Someone had been in the elevator. Someone had been watching me. It wasn't just the man in the blue coat. There was more. I stopped, right in the middle of the street, my feet rooted to the spot. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, to get some sense of clarity. My mind raced through the events of the past few days, the strange notes under my door, the eerie feelings of being watched, the sense of being haunted. Every little thing was connected. But the truth was too terrifying to face. He was inside the building. He had been there. In the elevator, on the floors. He had never left. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. I opened my eyes, scanning the street, but the man in the blue coat was gone. He was no longer at the corner. In fact, there was no sign of him at all. But something felt off. The quiet that had once felt so empty was now suffocating. Every passing car, every whisper of the wind seemed louder, more deliberate. And then, I heard it. The faint sound of someone breathing behind me. Soft, like a whisper, like a memory. I turned around in a flash, my pulse spiking. There, at the end of the street, standing under the flickering street lamp, was the man in the blue coat again. This time, though, there was something different. His face was visible now, pale, expressionless, and it seemed impossibly still. I stepped back, and this time, my legs weren't frozen. I didn't hesitate. I ran, harder and faster than before, not caring where I went, just desperate to put distance between us. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many corners I turned, the man in the blue coat was always there, following, just out of sight but never far behind. I reached a park at the edge of the neighborhood. The benches were empty, the playground silent. I couldn't hear my breathing anymore. All I could hear was the sound of my shoes pounding against the pavement, each step in sync with the thumping of my heart. Suddenly, I stopped. The air around me had changed. It was thicker now, heavier, as if the world itself had come to a standstill. The streetlights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the park into darkness. The only light came from the glow of the distant city skyline, but it felt so far away. So unreachable. I heard a shuffle of feet behind me. Slow, deliberate steps. the sound of fabric brushing against fabric. I turned around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The park was empty, silent, save for the quiet rustling of leaves in the trees. But then I saw it. A note. It was lying on the ground, just a few feet away from me. I reached down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. The note was torn, edges frayed, but the words were clear, etched into the paper with a dark ink. "You can't escape me." I froze. The words sent a chill through my bones, and for the first time, I understood. This wasn't just some sick game. This wasn't just about following me, watching me. It was about control. I wasn't the one in charge here. I turned and ran again, but it was too late. The world seemed to shift and bend around me. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if the very earth was slipping away. I was trapped in this maze, running in circles, chasing shadows. And then I heard it, his voice, clearer than ever, echoing around me. "You've been looking for me. And now, you've found me." I stopped. I didn't look back. There was no need. I knew the truth now. I had never been in control. Not once. And as the world around me blurred and twisted, I understood one final thing. I wasn't the one being hunted. I was the prey. And the hunter was always watching. Every night, without fail, I hear it. A child's laughter. Soft, sweet, and somehow distant, yet unmistakably clear. It drifts in through the window, carrying with it a strange kind of chill that sinks into my bones. I never used to hear it. The first time, I thought it was just my imagination. But the sound came again the next night, and the next, and the one after that. I lie in bed, the darkness pressing in around me, and listen. It's always the same. The laughter is high-pitched and playful, as if a group of children are enjoying some game. But there's no one outside. The street is silent when I look. I try to tell myself it's just a trick of the wind, or maybe a memory playing tricks on me. But something about it feels wrong, like a whisper from a place I can't quite see. It's never loud enough to make me rush to the window, but just enough to unsettle me. It's as if the sound is coming from somewhere just beyond my reach, a little too far for me to find its source. The house creaks around me, settling into the night. I stare at the ceiling, listening. A sudden breeze blows through the open window, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves. But along with it, the laughter comes again. This time, it's closer. Almost as if the children are playing directly beneath my window. I sit up in bed, my heart suddenly pounding. It's not the first time I've heard it at this hour, but tonight feels different. The air is heavy, thick with the kind of silence that makes every sound seem too loud. I press my hand to my chest, feeling the thudding of my pulse. The laughter echoes once more, sharp and clear. I slide out of bed, my feet making soft impressions on the cold wooden floor. I reach for the window, my hand shaking slightly as I pull back the curtain. The street outside is bathed in moonlight, the pavement empty, still. There's no sign of any children, no figures darting through the shadows. Only the dim glow of streetlights stretching out in long, lonely lines. I stare out into the quiet. There's no one. And yet, the laughter lingers in my ears, almost like a memory that refuses to fade. It's distant now, almost as if it's drifting away, carried off by the wind. I shake my head and close the window, the laughter finally fading into the night. But as I crawl back into bed, I can't help but feel something is wrong. The house is still, but it's not empty. Not tonight. A strange thought occurs to me. What if the laughter isn't meant for me? What if it's meant for someone else? And what if I'm not the only one listening? The night stretches on, but I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it again, the laughter. It isn't just the sound of children playing. There's something unsettling about it. It's too innocent, yet it carries a hidden weight, as if it's not meant for the ears of anyone living. I tell myself it's nothing more than an odd coincidence. Maybe the laughter belongs to some children playing late at night in the distance. But why does it always come from beneath my window? Why, after all this time, is it still so persistent, so constant? I get up and walk over to the window again. This time, I'm more determined. I push the curtain aside with a little more force than usual. The street is empty. I see only the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, the air suddenly colder than before. I stare down into the darkness, my eyes straining to make sense of anything that doesn't belong. There's nothing. Just the quiet emptiness of the street. Still, my gaze lingers. I don't know why, but something compels me to keep looking. I'm searching, not for the laughter, but for something else. I can't name it, but I feel it in my bones. And then, just as I begin to turn away, I catch a glimpse of something unusual. A shadow. It's not large, and it doesn't move, but it's there. Right at the edge of the street, where the shadows of the trees stretch long across the pavement. It's darker than the night itself, a faint figure that doesn't belong in the dim light. For a moment, I think I've imagined it, but then I hear it, so faint I almost miss it, the soft rustle of something moving in the wind. The laughter comes again, sharp and sudden, like a spark of light in the dark. It's closer now, too close. My heart races as I press my hand against the window, feeling the cold glass beneath my fingertips. I can't pull my eyes away from the spot where the shadow lingers. Then, just as I'm about to turn away in fear, the shadow shifts. It's subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. I pull the curtain shut quickly, my breath shallow and fast, but the laughter, oh, the laughter, continues, echoing in my ears. I try to convince myself that it's nothing, that it's just the wind, or the sound of some child playing down the street, or perhaps a neighbor's late-night conversation. But deep down, I know it's not. Something is out there, and it's watching. I return to bed, but sleep evades me. I close my eyes, but the laughter follows me, persistent and haunting. The night feels different now. I feel exposed, like something is waiting for me to look again. And I can't help but wonder, what is it that's so desperate to make me see? The following night, I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. The laughter hasn't stopped, and it seems to follow me wherever I go in the house, echoing in the back of my mind like a constant, taunting whisper. Each time I try to ignore it, the sound grows louder, more distinct, until I feel it right beside me, close enough to touch. I can't take it anymore. I've tried every rational explanation, children playing somewhere down the street, an odd echo bouncing off the buildings, some trick of my mind, but it doesn't make sense anymore. I'm not sure why, but tonight feels different. The laughter doesn't seem playful anymore. It's almost knowing. I spend the evening pacing the rooms, glancing nervously at the window every few minutes. The house feels suffocating, its walls closing in on me. Finally, as the night stretches into the early hours of the morning, I decide to confront whatever it is that's been haunting me. I slip out of bed quietly, trying not to wake my sleeping husband. My feet are cold against the hardwood floor, but I barely notice as I make my way to the window once more. This time, I'm determined to look longer, to find out what's really out there. The air in the room feels thick, almost too still, and the faint scent of dampness lingers. When I pull the curtain back, I don't see the shadow right away, but I can feel it there, just outside my line of sight, as if it's waiting for me to look. I lean forward, straining to see. And then, there. A flash of movement. A figure, small and quick, darting across the street. It's too fast for me to make out clearly, but it's definitely there. It looks like a child, or maybe several children, but their movements are jerky, unnatural. The laughter rings out once more, a chilling sound that makes my skin crawl. It's no longer distant, it's right beneath my window, too close, too real. I pull the curtain back quickly and stand frozen in the dark. I don't know what's happening, but I can feel the presence of something or someone right outside. I can hear them whispering just beyond my reach. Then, through the silence, I hear something else. A soft scrape against the window. I freeze. My heart pounds in my chest as I turn slowly toward the sound. At first, I see nothing. But as I peer closer, I notice something resting on the windowsill. Something small, almost hidden in the shadow. My breath catches in my throat. It's a toy. A tiny wooden doll, its paint chipped and worn. The kind of toy children would play with, but forgotten long ago. I don't remember seeing it there before. I don't remember ever owning it. I reach for the doll, my fingers trembling as I lift it from the sill. The laughter fades, replaced by a deep, eerie silence. And then it happens. The toy moves. Just a little, but enough to make my heart stop. It's as if something is gently shifting it, making it tilt toward me. I drop it immediately, the sound of wood hitting the floor echoing in the stillness of the room. For a long moment, I just stand there, staring at the doll, my breath caught in my throat. I can't look away. My mind races, trying to understand what I've just seen. Was it a trick of the light? Was it the wind? But deep down, I know it wasn't. Something is here. And it knows I'm watching. The room feels colder now. The silence stretches out, thick and heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. My hand shakes as I stare at the wooden doll on the floor, the small figure now lying motionless, as if mocking my fear. I should leave. I should run, wake my husband, and tell him what's happening. But my feet won't move. I feel rooted to the spot, as though something is holding me there, forcing me to watch. The faint laugh from earlier has disappeared, but I can still hear it echoing in my mind, reverberating through the walls of the house, an inescapable presence that clings to my thoughts. I take a step back, my breath shallow, eyes never leaving the doll. The shadows in the room seem to shift, their edges no longer as defined, as though the darkness itself is moving, creeping closer. I want to close my eyes, to turn away, but I can't. The doll lies perfectly still now, yet something in the room has changed. There's an energy here, an awareness, that wasn't there before. The atmosphere feels thick with it, like the air has turned to liquid, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, I hear it again. A soft creak. Faint but deliberate, like footsteps on the floor. My heart skips a beat as I glance around, but the room is empty. Nothing moves. The toy remains where it fell. I force myself to look at the window. It's closed. The curtain is drawn. There's no one outside. But I can feel it. The presence is closer now, just beyond the thin walls of the room, pressing in on me. My mind races. Who or what is watching me? What do they want? I take a breath and kneel down to pick up the doll, my fingers brushing the cold wood. But as soon as my hand touches it, I freeze. The faintest whisper. A voice, so low I almost don't hear it. It says my name. Emily. My blood runs cold. No one calls me Emily. Not since I was a child. The voice is unmistakable, and it's coming from the other side of the room. I turn my head slowly, and there, standing in the corner, is a figure. I don't know how it got there. I don't know how long it's been standing there. The figure is a child, but its features are distorted, too blurry to make out. I can only see the outline, the shape, and the pale glow of something, watching. My legs tremble, and I stand, backing away toward the door. The figure remains still, unmoving, its presence like a cold wind sweeping through the room. The shadows seem to grow deeper around it, as if it's pulling the very light from the room. Leave. The voice whispers again, so soft, so calm, yet somehow filled with a darkness I can't comprehend. Leave, and you'll be safe. I feel the weight of the words, a warning, a command. The fear clutches at my throat, making it hard to breathe, and yet I can't look away. My body doesn't obey. I step forward, toward the door. But then, just as I reach the handle, I hear the laughter again. It's not outside this time. It's inside, echoing through the walls, louder, sharper. It fills the entire house, the sound of children laughing, shrill and mocking. And then, as if in response to my hesitation, the figure steps forward. It's not a child anymore. Not fully. The face is twisted, too distorted, like a mask of something both familiar and utterly alien. A mouth opens wide, too wide, and the laugh that escapes it is no longer the sound of a child's joy, but something dark and hungry. The room spins. My mind screams to run, but my feet can't move. My body is paralyzed with terror. Leave, the voice says again, but this time I can't tell if it's a warning or a promise. Suddenly, I hear a soft tap on the floor behind me. I don't turn around. I don't want to. The floorboards creak, and then, as if the house itself is breathing, the figure moves closer. I finally force myself to turn the handle and pull the door open, but as I do, I hear the sound of the doll scraping across the floor, rolling slowly toward me. I don't look back as I step out into the hallway, and I don't stop running. I don't stop running. My feet pound against the hardwood floor, the sound of my own breath ragged and desperate in the silence. I don't dare to look behind me. I can still feel the presence, that cold, suffocating weight pressing in on me, but I won't look back. If I do, I know I'll see it. I know I'll see those eyes, or that twisted smile, or worse, that child's figure, waiting, watching, too close. I reach the stairs, my hand gripping the railing, and for a brief moment, I hear something shift behind me. The sound of movement. I can't bring myself to look. I force my legs to keep moving, to keep climbing. I reach the second floor and race toward the bedroom, my thoughts scattered, frantic. I need to wake him. I need to make him see. The house feels like it's closing in around me, the walls narrowing as if trying to trap me in this nightmare. I burst into the bedroom, and there he is, sleeping soundly, oblivious to the terror I'm running from. I shake him violently, my voice breaking through the quiet night. Wake up! Please, wake up! He stirs, his eyes flickering open, groggy and confused. What's wrong? His voice is thick with sleep, but there's something in his eyes, something that feels wrong to me now. The children. The laughter. There's something in the house. You have to believe me, my words tumble out, frantic and rushed. But before I can finish, the air shifts again, like a gust of wind that suddenly entered the room, even though the windows are closed. I feel it, something is in the room with us. I glance toward the door, and there it is again. The shadow. It's no longer outside. It's inside, standing just at the threshold, too still, too silent. I can't see its face, but I feel its gaze burning through me, as if it knows everything, as if it's been waiting for me to turn, to look. My husband sits up now, rubbing his eyes, his confusion slowly turning into concern. What's going on, Emily? What's happening? The figure doesn't move, doesn't speak, but the silence is unbearable. Then, almost as if mocking me, the laughter comes again. Clearer now, louder than before, rising up from the very walls of the house. I can't take it anymore. I scream, a raw, desperate sound that echoes through the empty house. My husband stands up, rushing to my side, but when he turns to look at the door, his face goes pale. I don't see anything, he says, his voice trembling. There's nothing there. But I know what I saw. I know what I feel. The weight of it all is suffocating, pressing on me from all sides, tightening with every passing second. The laughter grows louder. It's no longer just the sound of children, it's something else, something darker. It fills the air, surrounds us, almost as if it's coming from inside our very minds. And then, without warning, the lights flicker and die. Darkness swallows the room, and in that moment, I feel it, the cold hands that grab at my ankles, pulling me toward the floor. My husband shouts, but his voice is swallowed by the laughter, by the darkness that surrounds us. I try to move, but I can't. I feel myself slipping, sliding down into the blackness, the floor beneath me cold and wet as if the house itself is bleeding. I scream again, reaching for him, but my voice is drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in the quiet. The laughter is unbearable now, all-consuming, suffocating. And then I hear it. A whisper, right next to my ear, soft and cold. Leave, or you will stay. In the darkness, I feel the floor shift beneath me, the ground buckling as though the house itself is alive, shifting, breathing. And then, nothing. Silence. The laughter stops. The cold hands release their grip. The air grows still, eerily so. I try to move, but my body is frozen in place, too afraid to even breathe. I hear my husband's voice again, weak, panicked. Emily? Emily, where are you? But there is no answer. The darkness is too complete. The house is too silent. And I know, deep down, that whatever was here, whatever that presence was, it has taken something from me. Something I can't name. And I realize, too late, that the laughter was never meant for me. It was never meant for any of us. The house, the toy, the shadows, they were never just signs. They were warnings. Warnings that now, no one will hear. The final step has already been taken. And I will never leave. It's strange, isn't it, how quickly silence can become unsettling? The hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the streetlights outside, the sound of my own breathing, they all blend into a steady rhythm. I live alone, and the apartment feels like mine in every sense. The furniture is arranged just the way I like it. Everything is in its place, and I've become comfortable with the quiet. In a way, it's peaceful. But lately, there's something off. It started a few weeks ago. At first, it was nothing, a soft noise in the hallway, a door that creaked when it shouldn't have. Small things. Things that could be easily explained away. But I knew something was wrong when I found the first note. It was in my notebook. The one I keep by the couch, where I jot down thoughts, ideas, reminders, whatever comes to mind. I remember flipping through the pages just like any other evening, the soft rustling of paper against my fingertips. And then I saw it. I see you. The handwriting was unfamiliar. It wasn't mine. I could feel the blood drain from my face as my eyes traced those words, the ink still fresh on the page. I hadn't written that. I'm sure of it. I hadn't written anything that night or the night before. At first, I thought maybe it was a joke, a prank from a friend. But then I realized it wasn't possible. No one had been in the apartment. I lock the door when I come in, and I always keep it locked when I'm inside. There's no way someone could have gotten in without me knowing. I stood there, frozen in the dim light of the living room, staring at the page. The apartment felt colder all of a sudden. I could almost hear the faint whisper of a draft, but I dismissed it. I turned the page over, hoping to find something else. Something that would make sense of it. But there was nothing. No more strange writing. No clue. Just an empty page staring back at me. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of confusion. I must have written it myself and forgotten. Or maybe it was a dream I had forgotten to wake from. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't ignore it. I didn't sleep well that night, the thought of that note gnawing at the back of my mind. The more I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the more it felt like a warning. The next day, I threw the notebook into a drawer. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to be reminded. But the unease lingered, hanging in the air like a fog. And for days, it was just there, this gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I began to hear things. Soft sounds, like someone walking through the apartment when I was the only one home. A quiet tap on the walls, a creak of floorboards. But when I would check, everything was exactly as it should be, empty. The silence, once my comfort, had become something else. It was oppressive. The apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like it was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. After all, nothing had happened. No one had shown up. No one had broken in. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, last night, something else happened. Something I couldn't explain. I was sitting at the kitchen table, working, when I noticed something on the counter. A piece of paper, folded in half, just sitting there. I hadn't seen it before. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and opened it. It read, "I see you." Again. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I read those words. This time, the handwriting was more urgent, more insistent. And I was certain it wasn't mine. It was in my apartment. Again. But there was no one here. No one else. Just me. I tried to shake it off, tried to reason with myself. But I couldn't. I'm not alone here. And somehow, I know that whatever, or whoever, this is, it's watching me. I didn't sleep at all that night. The note sat on the kitchen counter, the words still burned into my mind, refusing to let go. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw it. I see you. The repetition of those words felt like a slow burn, creeping into every corner of my thoughts. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft whisper of wind outside my window made me jump. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was being irrational. After all, nothing had happened. No one had broken in. There was no physical evidence to suggest I wasn't alone. But then, why did I feel it? Why did I feel so watched? I spent the day in a haze, my mind foggy, the unease growing stronger with every hour that passed. I tried to distract myself, cleaning the apartment, organizing my things. But it didn't help. It just made the apartment feel emptier, more hollow. The silence pressed down on me harder, as if the very walls were closing in. I had dinner alone, as I always did. The sound of my fork scraping against the plate was the only noise in the apartment. As I sat at the table, I found myself glancing toward the hallway. My eyes kept flicking to the dark space between the living room and the bedroom, the place where shadows lingered, where the light never quite reached. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to let my mind wander, but I couldn't help it. It was there again. Just at the edge of the hallway, where the light from the living room met the darkness, I saw it, a shadow. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something solid, a dark figure that seemed to be watching me. It stood motionless, just beyond the reach of the light, blending into the dark. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at the shadow, willing myself to move, to do something, but I couldn't. It was as if my body wouldn't obey. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, a figment of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was there. Something I couldn't explain. Something I couldn't see. I decided to check the hallway to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked slowly toward the dark corridor. Every step felt like a mile. My heart was pounding in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. I reached the end of the hallway, my eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Nothing but silence. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and turned to go back to the living room. But just as I did, I heard it. A soft tap. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then it came again, this time louder. A tap, then a pause, followed by another tap. It was coming from somewhere in the hallway. Somewhere behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my breathing shallow. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. I rushed back to the living room, slamming the door behind me, and locked it. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone in my hands, my mind racing. I kept hearing the taps in my head, the soft, deliberate rhythm that echoed through my skull. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something, someone, was always just behind me, just out of reach. The apartment felt different now. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a trap. I picked up my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it. I had to know. I had to check. Maybe there was something I was missing, something that would explain all of this. I opened the Notes app, searching for something, anything that would make sense of what was happening. And that's when I saw it. A new note. I see you, and I'm coming closer. My blood ran cold. The words were even more chilling than before. Whoever, whatever, was leaving these notes, they were getting closer. They weren't just watching me from a distance anymore. They were inside my apartment. They were here. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to leave. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and ran toward the door. But just as I reached for the handle, I stopped. The hallway light flickered. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing there in the dark. A shadow, tall and thin, like a figure watching from the end of the hall. And then the light went out completely. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I thought it might burst. I was no longer alone. The darkness swallowed the room. The hallway beyond the living room seemed endless now, a black void where even the faintest light couldn't reach. I could feel it. I could feel the presence. It was there. Watching. Waiting. I froze, my hands still on the doorknob, unable to move. My mind was screaming at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. The silence around me was deafening, so thick it felt like it could suffocate me at any moment. All I could hear was my breath, sharp and shallow, and the distant sound of my heartbeat, like a drum in my chest. I turned my head toward the hallway again. The light was out, completely dark now. I couldn't even see the outline of the door. Just a black void where everything felt off, like something was about to emerge from the dark. A soft scrape broke the silence, like something, or someone, dragging their feet across the floor. It came from the hallway. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there. But my body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The scrape was followed by another, and then a faint tapping, almost like fingers tapping lightly against the wall. "Stop," I whispered to myself. "This is just my mind playing tricks. It's nothing. It's nothing." But the sound didn't stop. It got louder. Closer. The dragging sound of feet across the floor, the soft tap of fingers on the wall. And then I heard it. A voice. Low. Quiet. But unmistakable. "I see you." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a whisper. It wasn't just in my head. It came from the hallway. It came from the dark. The note. The message. It was real. I slammed my back against the door, my pulse racing. My mind spun, frantic, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How was this possible? Who was in my apartment? How could they know where I was? I ran to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I grabbed a knife from the drawer. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but I had to feel like I had some control, some chance to protect myself. My eyes darted back toward the hallway, expecting something to appear at any moment. And then, just as I thought I could catch my breath, the lights flickered again. Not the hallway light, but the overhead lights in the living room. Once, twice, and then they went out completely. I gasped. The apartment was now completely dark. I couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I stood still, listening, trying to hear anything that would give me a clue about where it was, about where the person, or whatever it was hiding. The silence was unbearable. And then I heard it. A faint shuffle, like footsteps moving across the room. Slow. Deliberate. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, the knife trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there. The living room was empty. The walls were empty. The apartment was empty. But I knew it wasn't. The voice came again, closer this time. I see you, and you're not alone. I dropped the knife. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees. The fear was overwhelming now, so strong that I couldn't think. My mind was foggy, trapped in the panic that was seizing me. I looked around, desperate for any sign of safety, any way out. But the apartment was closing in on me, the walls growing tighter, the space shrinking. And then I saw it. A shadow. It moved across the room, not in the hallway, but in the living room itself, right in front of me. It was fast, so fast, a dark blur that melted into the wall as if it never existed. But I saw it. It was there. I wasn't alone. I had no idea how much time passed, how long I sat there on the floor, unable to move. My body was stiff, numb with fear. But then, just as suddenly as it all began, the silence returned. I dared to breathe again, my chest tight, my throat dry. It was over. Or at least, I thought it was. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grabbed my phone. My fingers were slick with sweat, but I forced myself to unlock it. I had to call someone. I had to get help. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. There was a new notification. A message. From an unknown number. I see you. I'm in your apartment. I looked up, my eyes wild, scanning the room. The apartment was empty. Or so it seemed. But I knew better now. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, my eyes darting around the room, desperate to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Only silence. The message on my phone was a punch to the gut. It felt like it had been written just for me, like the words were crawling into my mind, making me question everything around me. How could they be in my apartment? How could they know what I was doing? I dropped my phone, the screen cracking on the floor, but I didn't care. The sound of the shattering glass echoed in the silence, cutting through the air like a warning. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts spinning faster than I could keep up. And then, as if on cue, the voice came again. I see you. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a distant murmur from the hallway. It was clear, sharp, and coming from inside the apartment. Inside. I turned toward the voice, every muscle in my body locking up. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It wasn't coming from any corner I could see. It was as if it was coming from the walls themselves, from the space between the plaster and the wooden beams. I stepped back, my eyes wide, searching every corner of the living room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. No, this couldn't be happening. This was impossible. I was losing my mind. I see you, and I'm closer now. The voice was louder, and it sounded like it was coming from right next to me. The walls creaked, the air thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight. The room seemed to close in on me, and I could feel my sanity slipping away with every second that passed. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to leave this place, this nightmare. I stumbled to my feet, grabbing whatever I could, my coat, my bag, and rushed toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. I pulled harder, but the door was stuck. It wouldn't open. My breathing quickened. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, and I hammered against the door, my fists banging against the wood in desperation. "Let me out!" I screamed, but no sound came. The walls groaned, the apartment shaking around me. The voice came again, clearer this time, as if it was standing right behind me. "I'm right here." I whirled around, my heart leaping in my chest. There, just beyond the shadows, I saw something. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the corner of the room. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, its edges blurry and shifting, like a shadow trying to take form. I could see nothing but darkness where its face should have been, just an endless, empty void where the eyes should have been. It stood still, its presence a thick, suffocating pressure in the room. The walls creaked again, louder this time. I could feel them, closing in on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. The figure didn't move. It just watched, and the silence between us stretched, broken only by the faint sound of something scraping against the walls. I couldn't take it. I couldn't stay here. I ran. I pushed through the door, my hands desperately turning the handle once more, and this time it gave. I slammed it open and bolted into the hallway, my mind numb with fear, my legs barely carrying me as I raced for the exit. But the hallway was different now. The space felt wrong, like the air itself had shifted. The walls seemed to close in around me, and every step I took made the floor creak louder, as if something was following just behind me, too close, too close. I reached the front door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. My fingers were slick with sweat, and the key wouldn't turn. Panic surged through me again. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and I could feel something cold, icy, brushing against the back of my neck. "You can't leave." The voice was right behind me now. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. I could feel it. It was in the air, in the space around me. The figure was too close. It was waiting for me to turn, to look, to make that mistake. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the apartment, like it was never there. And then, just as suddenly as the pressure had come, it vanished. The apartment was silent again. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling, but when I finally gathered enough strength to move, I managed to open the door. I stepped outside, feeling the cold night air hit my skin. The world outside felt real again, solid and familiar. But as I turned back to look at the door, I saw something. A note. Pinned to the doorframe, written in the same handwriting. "I see you, and I'm still watching." I didn't know what to think anymore. I didn't know what was real. I couldn't be sure of anything. But I knew one thing, wherever I went, whatever I did, I wasn't alone. The nightmare followed me, and it was never going to let me go. I stood frozen in place, staring at the note, my mind barely processing the words as they burned into my brain. "I see you, and I'm still watching." It felt like the world had collapsed into itself. The street, the cold night air, it all seemed distant and unreal. My body moved without my command, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let the thing inside my apartment find me again. But the note, it was clear. It wasn't over. I stepped back, my foot slipping on the wet pavement. The city around me was silent, as if it too had felt the weight of the presence that lingered in the apartment. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive, and the chill in the air gnawed at my bones. But I couldn't stop. My legs moved of their own accord, taking me down the street, farther from the building. I didn't know where I was going, or what I thought I could do. All I knew was that I couldn't be near that place anymore. I reached a corner and stopped to catch my breath. My phone buzzed in my pocket, sending a jolt through my body. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, and looked at the screen. There was a new message. From the same unknown number. You thought you could escape. But I'm still with you. Always watching. Always here. My blood ran cold. I scanned my surroundings, the dark alleyways and empty streets. There was no one, but the feeling of being watched, was overwhelming. I didn't know what to do anymore. Where could I go? The message, the voice, the shadow, it had all followed me, even here. I ran again, my breath coming in quick gasps, my legs carrying me aimlessly through the night. I didn't stop until I reached the park at the edge of the city, the familiar trees standing tall like silent sentinels in the dark. I collapsed onto a bench, my heart still pounding. I wanted to believe that I had outrun whatever had been haunting me, that I had left it behind in that apartment. But the fear was still there, crawling under my skin, refusing to let me go. And then, just as I thought I might be safe, I heard it. A soft scrape. A dragging sound, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from behind me, from the dark shadows near the park's entrance. I didn't move. I didn't dare. I didn't have the strength to face it again. But then, the voice came. Low, cruel, and familiar. I'm right behind you. I turned, slowly, the darkness blurring my vision. My legs were like lead, and my stomach churned. There was nothing there. No one. But the air felt wrong, heavy and thick with dread. The shadows shifted, swirling around me, as if they had a life of their own. I stood up quickly, ready to run, but something stopped me. It was the sound. The faintest sound of breathing. Not mine. It was coming from right behind me. I didn't turn to look. I didn't have to. The pressure in the air, the sense of coldness, it was enough. I knew it was here. And it wasn't going to let me go. I turned to face the empty street once more, but I didn't feel alone anymore. The weight of the presence pressed down on me, suffocating like it had always been with me. The darkness around me closed in tighter with each breath. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there, knowing that wherever I went, whatever I did, there would be no escape. Because the thing that haunted me, the thing that saw me, had never been just in the apartment. It was inside me now. It had always been. When I first moved into this apartment, I didn't think much of the building or its residents. It was a quiet, older place, tucked away on a small side street in the city. The kind of place you forget about if you didn't happen to live there. My life, like many people's, was filled with the ordinary things, work, errands, some time for myself. But that all changed when I met my neighbor. It happened one evening when I was carrying some groceries up to my apartment. The door to the stairwell opened, and there he was. A man in his early 60s, wearing a faded jacket and thick glasses. He had a tired but friendly face, and he was leaning against the railing as if waiting for me. New here? He asked with a curious smile. Yeah, just moved in, I replied, trying to be polite, though I was eager to get upstairs and unpack. We exchanged a few pleasantries about the building, and he mentioned that he'd been living there for years. He told me his name was Carl. I nodded, still feeling the rush of unpacking on my mind, but he continued, clearly wanting to talk. You'll find it quiet here, Carl said. Almost too quiet, sometimes. But that's the way I like it. I smiled awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. Something about his tone, the way his words lingered a little longer than necessary, made me feel uneasy. But I didn't want to be rude. He went on to mention that he had lived in the building for as long as he could remember. He seemed almost proud of it. And as we made our way up the stairs, he began telling me stories about the neighborhood, odd, half-forgotten tales that didn't seem to fit the place. Stories about strange occurrences, people who'd come and gone, but always with a peculiar sense of nostalgia. People don't stay long around here, Carl said, glancing at me as though waiting for me to respond. This place, it changes people. You'll see. I wasn't sure what he meant by that. I nodded politely, but his words seemed to hang in the air, thick and unsettling. When I got to my apartment, I made a quick excuse and shut the door behind me. I figured I'd be seeing Carl around more often. I didn't think much of the conversation. It was just a random encounter with an eccentric neighbor, nothing more. But over the next few weeks, Carl kept showing up. Not in a bothersome way, but in the honest, most unpredictable moments. He'd knock on my door at odd hours, never too late, but always when I was least expecting it. He'd ask about my day, or tell me about a dream he had. His stories were always strange, veering into the bizarre, and they seemed to circle back to the same topic. The apartment. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I was sitting in my living room, mindlessly watching TV when there was a knock on the door. Without thinking, I got up and opened it, expecting it to be Carl again. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. Hello, Carl said, his voice lower than usual. He was standing a little too close, his hands resting on the doorframe, almost as if he were afraid I might close the door too quickly. Can I come in for a minute? I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't want to be friendly, but something about Carl's request seemed off. It was as though he was trying to push me into something. I was just about to make dinner, I said, trying to come up with a reason to keep the conversation brief. Maybe another time? Carl didn't back away. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. I won't take much of your time. Just a quick chat. There was an odd pressure building in the air, like he was waiting for something. I reluctantly stepped aside, letting him in. We sat down at the small table in my kitchen. Carl immediately started telling me one of his odd stories, this time about a neighbor he had once known, a man who disappeared years ago. Carl described him in vivid detail, even down to the way he walked and the way his voice sounded. The thing was, Carl had never mentioned this neighbor before. In fact, I was sure I had never heard him speak of anyone in this building aside from himself. The story took a strange turn when Carl mentioned how the man had come to him one evening, saying something cryptic before vanishing without a trace. The man had claimed that the apartment wasn't what it seemed, that it was empty, even though Carl had seen him walk in just hours before. Empty? I asked, genuinely confused. What do you mean, empty? Carl leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. I mean, the apartment, like the others, was never meant to be inhabited. It changes the people who live here. Makes them forget. I stared at him, my confusion turning into unease. What are you talking about, Carl? This place has been here for years. People live here all the time. He didn't seem to hear me. He just kept going on, his eyes distant as he spoke. You'll understand soon enough, he said. Everyone forgets. Eventually, you'll forget, too. It was as if I had crossed some invisible line, stepping into a world I wasn't supposed to be in. The air around me grew heavier, the apartment suddenly feeling much smaller, more oppressive. I wanted to ask him more questions, but the words stuck in my throat. Carl stood up abruptly, and without another word, walked out the door. As I closed it behind him, I felt an uncomfortable tightness in my chest. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't place it. Maybe it was just Carl's eccentricity playing tricks on me. But later that night, something happened that made my heart race in a way it hadn't before. I looked at the wall in my hallway, where the door to Carl's apartment should have been, and I froze. There was no door. It was just a blank wall. I stood there, staring at the spot where Carl's door should have been, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It had always been there, I was sure of it. A dull brown door with a small brass number on it. But now, nothing. Just a smooth wall where the door had once been. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cool surface of the wall. It felt solid, normal, even, but the absence of the door was unsettling. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a sudden, oppressive silence fill the apartment. I turned around quickly, checking the rest of the hallway. No one else was around. It was just me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that maybe I was just tired. I'd been working long hours lately, and maybe the stress was starting to affect my perception. It could be that I had simply never noticed the blank wall before, or that my memory was playing tricks on me. But as I made my way back into my apartment, the thought gnawed at me. I couldn't stop thinking about Carl and his strange words. Everyone forgets. Eventually, you'll forget, too. The more I thought about it, the more his words seemed to hold some sort of truth. Something about this place didn't add up. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but the image on the screen blurred, and I found myself staring blankly at the flickering light. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept returning to Carl and the empty spot in the hallway. I felt like I was unraveling, like something deep inside me was slowly coming undone. The next day, I decided to confront the situation. I needed to know if I had just imagined the whole thing or if there was something truly wrong with the apartment building. I went down to the building's front office, where the superintendent, an elderly woman named Mrs. Calloway, usually sat behind the desk. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to ask you something about the apartment next to mine. The one with Carl in it." Mrs. Calloway looked up from her paperwork, her expression unreadable. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning me for a moment before speaking. "Carl?" "There's no Carl in that apartment," she said, her voice calm but firm. I blinked, unsure of what she meant. "No Carl? But I've seen him. He's been living there for years. We talk sometimes." Mrs. Calloway frowned, her face tightening. "That apartment has been empty for over 5 years. No one has lived there in a long time." A wave of disbelief washed over me, followed by a creeping sense of dread. "That's not possible. I've talked to him. He's there every week." She shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, but there's no one living in that apartment. And there hasn't been for a long time. Maybe you're mistaken." I wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. What if I was going crazy? What if I had imagined Carl completely? But then I remembered the strange way he'd spoken to me, his words about the apartment changing people. He had to be real. Hadn't I seen him? Heard his voice? Are you sure? I pressed, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. Mrs. Calloway looked at me with a strange, almost pitying expression. Yes. I'm sure. I'd suggest you take a break, maybe get some fresh air. You look like you need it. I left her office in a daze, my mind reeling. The whole conversation felt like a nightmare, a part of some twisted, half-forgotten dream. I wasn't sure what to think anymore. Was I imagining things? Was Carl real, or was I losing my grip on reality? As I walked back down the hallway to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was watching me. The silence of the building felt thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, and I could feel the weight of the air around me growing heavier with each step. I paused at the spot where Carl's door should have been again. The blank wall stood before me, an unbroken surface. There was no sign of a door, no indication that anyone had ever lived there. It was as if Carl had never existed at all. But I knew he had. I could still hear his voice in my mind, the way he'd spoken to me in his slow, deliberate way. His stories about the apartment, about the strange things that happened here. He had to be real. I wasn't imagining him. I pressed my hand against the wall, hoping for some sign, some proof that it wasn't all just in my head. As my fingers made contact with the surface, I felt a strange vibration beneath my touch. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger the longer I kept my hand there. Suddenly, the wall shifted. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a feeling, a change in the atmosphere. I pulled my hand away in shock, but the sensation lingered. Something was wrong. This place wasn't what it seemed. I turned quickly and rushed into my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process everything that had just happened. I could hear the soft, distant hum of something, maybe the building settling or maybe something else entirely. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened with Carl was far from over. And now, I had a terrible, gut-wrenching feeling that I was about to find out exactly what this place was capable of. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to the conversation with Mrs. Calloway. No Carl in the building? It didn't make sense. It couldn't be true. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling details emerged. The little things I had ignored, the way Carl always seemed to appear when no one else was around, the odd way his stories never seemed to match up with reality, the strange feeling that he knew things about me before I even said them. I tossed and turned in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like something was just waiting for me to acknowledge it. I wanted to forget, to move on. But I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. I needed proof. Proof that Carl had existed, that he wasn't some figment of my imagination. I went down to the building's front desk again, determined to get more information from Mrs. Calloway. Maybe there was something she was hiding, something she wasn't telling me. But when I arrived, the office was empty. The fluorescent light buzzed above me, casting harsh shadows across the desk. I knocked, then pushed the door open slightly, but there was no answer. My heart started to race, and I felt that familiar feeling of dread creeping up my spine. I wandered the building for a while, looking for anything that might give me an answer. The hallways were eerily quiet. No sounds, no voices, just the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional footstep echoing off the walls. It was like everyone had vanished. Even the other tenants, the ones I'd seen in passing, were nowhere to be found. As I made my way back toward my apartment, I passed Carl's door once more, or rather, the spot where it used to be. But something was different this time. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from behind the wall. I pressed my ear against it, trying to make out what it was. It sounded like murmuring, soft voices, almost like whispers. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I had to know what was behind that wall. Maybe Carl had left something there, a clue, a message. I had to find out. I quickly grabbed a screwdriver from my kitchen drawer and returned to the hallway. There was no one around, no one to stop me. I hesitated for a moment, then began to carefully remove the screws from the wall. The paneling was thin, and it came off easily. My hands were trembling, but I forced myself to keep going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wall came loose. I peered into the small gap I had created, expecting to see, I don't know, a clue, a note, maybe even some sign that Carl had been there. Instead, I found darkness. Nothing but the emptiness of the wall cavity. I took a step back, blinking in confusion. I was certain I had heard something, voices, whispers. But now, there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the apartment building. I turned to leave, but then I saw something. It was a faint light, flickering deep within the wall, coming from a crack I hadn't noticed before. My heart skipped a beat. I moved closer, peering into the darkness. The light flickered again, and this time I was sure I saw something, a shadow moving just beyond the gap. Before I could react, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around in shock, my heart racing, but there was no one behind me. The hallway was empty, just like it always had been. But the feeling of being watched lingered, cold and suffocating. I slammed the panel back into place and rushed back to my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind was reeling. What was happening? What had I just seen? I tried to push it all out of my mind, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Something in this building, in this apartment, was wrong. And I was beginning to realize that whatever it wasn't going to let me leave easily. The whispers, the strange occurrences, the absence of Carl, none of it made sense. And yet, the more I tried to ignore it, the more real it all seemed. I couldn't escape it. I lay down on my couch, staring at the ceiling, but sleep didn't come. I couldn't stop thinking about Carl and the empty apartment. I kept seeing his face, hearing his voice in my mind. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled deeper into something that I didn't understand. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before whatever was happening consumed me completely. But the more I thought about leaving, the more I realized there was no place to go. The apartment was my only home. And now, it seemed like it was closing in on me, its walls closing tighter with every passing moment. I sat up, my heart pounding. A knock at the door. It was a soft tap, almost too quiet to hear, but I couldn't ignore it. I froze. Was it Carl? Or was it something else? I approached the door cautiously, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Should I open it? Was I ready to face whatever was on the other side? With a trembling hand, I turned the knob. The door creaked open, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving just beyond the threshold. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just empty air. I closed the door quickly, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in my ears. I didn't know what was real anymore, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. The door slammed shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still standing on the other side. I pressed my back to it, breathing heavily, staring at the space around me like I was expecting something to leap out from the shadows. My apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign, like I had wandered into someone else's life, someone else's nightmare. For the next few days, I couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment. I called in sick to work, claiming exhaustion, but it wasn't the physical kind. It was something deeper, an unease I couldn't escape. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Carl's face. Not in my memories, but in the corners of my vision. And each time I tried to recall details of our conversations, they began to blur and distort, like a fog settling over my mind. I kept hearing whispers in the apartment, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from behind the walls, from the floors and ceiling. I tried to ignore them, but it felt like they were growing louder, more insistent. And then, one night, I finally saw him again. It wasn't in the hallway this time. It wasn't in the corner of the room or at my window. No, this time, Carl was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, as if nothing had ever changed. I jumped back, my pulse racing, my hands trembling. I couldn't understand it. Carl was supposed to be gone. He was supposed to be a figment of my imagination, a mistake, a misunderstanding. But there he was, smiling at me, as if nothing had happened. His eyes gleamed, but they weren't warm. They were empty. "Why haven't you been coming over to visit?" he asked, his voice soft, almost playful. "I miss our talks." I stood frozen, my body paralyzed by confusion and fear. How was he here? How was he in my apartment when I knew he wasn't real? I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? How could I explain to him that I knew the truth, that he was nothing more than an illusion, a ghost from some twisted version of reality? "You've been avoiding me," Carl said, his voice turning cold. "You think you can just ignore me and everything will go back to normal? You can't. You can't escape it." His words echoed in my mind, reverberating through the empty space of my apartment. I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever was happening consumed me entirely. But then something changed. Carl's figure began to flicker, like a bad signal on a television. He wasn't solid anymore. He was fading, becoming translucent, like he was part of the air itself. "I'm still here," he whispered, his voice now distant, as if coming from across a vast chasm. "I'm always here." And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. I stood there, my heart pounding, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I looked around the room, my hands shaking, desperate to make sense of it all. The apartment was quiet again, but it felt wrong, too quiet, like the world itself was holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night. The sound of Carl's voice lingered in my mind, a constant hum, like a memory I couldn't escape. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But the walls, the furniture, everything around me felt too real, too solid. The apartment felt like it was closing in on me, its rooms growing smaller, suffocating. The next morning, I forced myself to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to talk to someone, anyone, to make sense of what was happening. I walked down the street, feeling the weight of the world pressing against my chest, my mind racing with thoughts and doubts. And then, as if the universe was playing some cruel joke, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. There, standing in front of me, was Carl. He was smiling, just like before. He looked exactly the same, like nothing had ever changed. But this time, I wasn't confused. I wasn't afraid. I was certain of one thing: Carl wasn't real. He couldn't be. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You can't be." Carl didn't respond at first. He just stood there, smiling, his eyes gleaming with that same empty look. But then, slowly, he nodded. "I'm not real," he said softly, almost as if he were admitting a secret. "Not to you." I felt my stomach drop. My mind was racing, spinning, trying to process his words. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Carl's smile widened, but it wasn't comforting. It was like a mask, something meant to hide the truth beneath it. "It's all a game," he said. "You're the one who created me. The one who's been fooling yourself. I'm just a reflection of you, a part of you that you don't want to face." I backed away, stumbling, as the realization hit me. Carl wasn't just a ghost, a figment of my imagination. He was something deeper, something I had created, something I couldn't escape. He stepped closer, his presence growing stronger, more oppressive. "You're trapped, just like me," he said. "And no matter where you go, no matter how far you run, I'll always be with you." I turned and ran, not looking back. I couldn't look back. I couldn't face him anymore. But as I ran, I could hear him behind me, his voice echoing in my mind, growing louder with every step. "I'm always here," he whispered. "I'm always with you." And I knew, in that moment, that I was never going to escape. I didn't return to the apartment that night. I couldn't. My legs ached from running, my breath ragged and shallow, but I didn't care. I just needed to put distance between myself and whatever Carl was, whatever he had become. I found an all-night diner, the kind that always smells of coffee and old leather, and sat in the farthest corner. The familiar sounds of clinking silverware, murmured conversations, and the hum of fluorescent lights felt like a balm, something to tether me to the reality I still desperately wanted to believe in. But as I sat there, my thoughts couldn't settle. The truth that Carl had spoken, the idea that I had created him, kept turning over in my mind like a broken record, relentless and haunting. Could it be possible? Could I have imagined all of this, every conversation, every detail? I looked out the window, staring at the streetlights. The quiet streets seemed so normal, so untouched, like the world had forgotten about me. But I couldn't forget. My mind kept circling back to the apartment, to Carl, and to the horror of his words, "I'm always with you." I didn't sleep that night, not truly. My thoughts would drift, and I would see Carl standing in the corner of my mind, always watching, always there. The next morning, I gathered my things and headed back to my apartment, not knowing what I expected to find. I couldn't keep running, but I also couldn't shake the overwhelming fear that if I stepped back inside, I would never leave again. I approached the building with trepidation, as if the very walls knew my secret. The hallway was quiet, almost too quiet, the air stale and heavy with something I couldn't name. I reached my door and stopped. There was nothing out of place. No sign of Carl, no indication that anything had ever been wrong. The apartment looked just as it always had, like the night before had been some kind of fever dream. But when I opened the door, I froze. The first thing I noticed was the smell, sharp, metallic, like old copper. I took a tentative step inside, my senses alert. The air felt thick, suffocating. It wasn't the quiet I had hoped for, it was an oppressive silence, as if the apartment was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, my eyes fell on the table, and my stomach dropped. There, on the kitchen table, was a notebook, my notebook. I hadn't left it there. I'd taken it with me. The pages were open, and as I walked closer, I saw that the words had been written in my handwriting in ink that had bled through the pages, smudged from use. But it wasn't what I had written. The page was filled with a single line, repeated over and over again, "I see you." I picked up the notebook, my fingers trembling, and turned the pages frantically. Every page, every line, was filled with that one sentence. "I see you." Over and over, as if it had been written for days. I turned quickly to the back cover. There was something new. A small, hurried note scribbled underneath the last line, "You can't escape." My mind reeled. The room spun. Was I going insane? Had I written this and somehow forgotten? No, I hadn't. I would have remembered. I heard a noise then, soft at first, like the faintest shuffle of feet behind me. My body tensed, and I whipped around, expecting to find Carl standing in the doorway, grinning that eerie smile. But there was nothing. I stepped back, my pulse racing, the notebook still clenched tightly in my hand. But the apartment felt wrong, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. My vision blurred, and the sounds of the room seemed muffled, as though I were submerged underwater. The silence was unbearable, stretching out, thick and suffocating. Then, I heard something. Not a sound, exactly, more like a feeling. A shift in the air. I looked towards the window. And there, standing just outside, in the fading light of the afternoon, was Carl. His figure was partially obscured by the glass, but I could still make out his face, his smile. His smile. It twisted. His eyes gleamed, but this time there was no warmth, no pretense of friendship. There was only the cold emptiness of someone or something that had no place in this world. He raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. I didn't wait for him to knock. I didn't wait for the door to open, for him to step inside. I ran. Out the door, down the hall, past the stairs, until my legs gave out and I collapsed against the cold concrete of the street below. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps, faint but growing louder, getting closer. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I've been running, or if I'm still running. I can't tell what's real anymore, and I don't know if I ever will. The world feels distorted now, like a painting someone has twisted, and I can't quite find the right way to see it. Every time I close my eyes, I hear Carl's voice, soft and mocking, always so close. "I see you," he whispers. "And no matter how far I go, no matter how hard I try to escape, I know one thing for certain, he's always with me. And he's never letting me go." I hadn't expected the letter to arrive so soon. In fact, I hadn't expected it at all. It had been a restless evening, my thoughts tangled in the usual clutter of worries and obligations. The sky outside had turned an oppressive gray, thick clouds hanging low, as though the world was holding its breath. I'd written to my old friend, as I often did, out of habit more than need. We hadn't seen each other in years, but something about writing to him gave me comfort. It was a simple letter, a casual check-in, nothing more. Yet, as I sealed the envelope and placed it in my mailbox, something felt slightly off. It was that feeling, the kind that clings to you in quiet moments, like when you forget something important but can't remember what. I shrugged it off. Perhaps it was just the weather. The next morning, I awoke to the familiar creak of the old house settling, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the quiet of a suburban neighborhood that I had grown used to. I shuffled to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, trying to shake the odd sense of unease that had settled over me the night before. I went to the front door to retrieve the mail. Most days, I barely gave it a second thought, but today I stood there for a moment, hesitant. The envelope caught my eye, my own handwriting on the front, unmistakable. The same letter I had posted just hours before. I blinked and pulled the envelope from the mailbox. My heart skipped a beat. It was my letter. The very one I had written to my friend, sealed and ready to go. But I hadn't received any reply. I hadn't expected one so soon. I was sure it had been mailed out the evening before, but here it was, in my hands again, as though it had never left. Confused, I tore open the envelope, the paper crinkling in my hands. The letter inside was identical to the one I had written. There was no sign of tampering, no different handwriting. Yet as I read the first few lines, my stomach twisted. I hadn't noticed it before, but there, in the corner of the page, was something new. A small scroll, barely legible, but they're all the same. I'm waiting for you. I froze. My pulse quickened as I reread the words. It was impossible. I had written the letter myself, sent it, and yet somehow this phrase had appeared. My mind raced. What was happening? Who had written this? I looked around the room, the walls seeming to close in, as though the house was suddenly too small for the thoughts swirling inside my head. I shook the letter again, hoping to see something different, something that would explain it. But there was nothing. Just the letter. Just the words. I stepped back from the table, feeling the cool draft that had begun to creep into the room. The house felt different now, like it was no longer just a place I lived in, but something that held secrets. My heart hammered in my chest. It wasn't just the letter that disturbed me, it was the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was waiting. And I wasn't sure who or what it was. I decided to call my friend, the one I had written to, just to hear his voice, to ground myself in something familiar. But when I picked up the phone and dialed, it went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I sat in silence, staring at the letter, waiting for the weight of the words to settle. Something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had changed somehow. The silence, once comforting, now felt suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I stared at the letter, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was impossible. There was no way it could have come back to me like this, no logical explanation. I needed to think. I needed to calm down. I placed the letter down on the table and tried to focus, tried to make sense of what was going on. But the more I thought about it, the more the unease gnawed at me. Something was wrong. I had been living in this house for years, and yet, right now, it felt unfamiliar, like a place I had never truly known. I stood up, pacing back and forth, trying to collect my thoughts. The words "I'm waiting for you" seemed to echo in my mind, as though they were not just written on paper, but somehow whispered by an unseen presence. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I glanced toward the window. Outside, everything appeared normal. The same street. The same neighbors walking their dogs. The same trees in the yard. But inside, the house felt different. It felt as if it were holding its breath, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I looked back at the letter. There was no way this was just some strange coincidence. No way someone had intercepted my mail and added a cryptic message. The handwriting was identical to my own, and I would have noticed if someone had tampered with the envelope. But then, why was it back? Why had it returned to me? The thought struck me suddenly, and I froze. What if I never actually sent the letter? The idea was absurd, but it lingered, making my heart race again. What if the entire process had been a blur, an illusion I had somehow created? What if I had imagined putting it in the mailbox, and in reality, I had never sent it at all? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. That was impossible. I remembered sealing the envelope. I remembered walking to the mailbox. I remembered sending it. But the letter was here again, in my hands, as if it had never left. The more I tried to explain it, the more it seemed like a twisted game, a game I was somehow losing without even understanding the rules. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to clear my mind. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face, the normality of the world outside offering some comfort. But even as I walked down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The houses were all the same as they always had been, the trees lined up neatly along the sidewalk, the same streetlights flickering on as dusk approached. And yet, there was something unsettling about it all now. I felt like an intruder in my own life. I stopped at the corner of the street and looked back at my house. Everything was still. But the air felt thick, heavy, as though something unseen was waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming urge to go home. Not because I wanted to, but because it was as though the house was calling me back, pulling me toward it. I turned and walked briskly toward my front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The letter was still on the table. I hadn't imagined it. It hadn't been a dream. It was real. But the strange, lingering sense of unease only deepened. I moved closer to the table, my eyes fixed on the letter. My hands shook as I reached for it. I turned it over. On the back, there was a single line scrawled across the envelope in a different handwriting, scraggly, hurried, almost frantic. You can't escape. I dropped the letter, the words burning into my mind. Panic surged through me. I staggered back, my breath quickening. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the air thick with something dark, something alive. I couldn't escape. The message was clear. But from what? I couldn't breathe. I stared at the letter, the words etched into my mind. You can't escape. The phrase echoed in my head like a chilling whisper that wouldn't leave. Every corner of the room seemed to press in closer, every shadow now felt like it had a life of its own. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the cold wall. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anything that should have been alarming, but the air was thick with an oppressive stillness. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but suffocating. It was as though the house itself was watching me, listening to every breath, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I reached for the letter again, my fingers trembling. The handwriting on the back, the frantic, desperate scribbling, had only added to my fear. I had never seen it before. I was sure of it. And yet, somehow, it felt familiar, like something I should have known. I ran my fingers over the paper, feeling the grooves where the ink had been pressed too hard, the hurried slashes that formed the words. I wanted to scream, to throw the letter away and forget everything that was happening, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if the house was holding me in place, as if the walls themselves were slowly growing taller, closer, until I was trapped inside my own home. I closed my eyes for a moment, forcing myself to take a deep breath. Calm down, I told myself. This is just some weird coincidence. There's a logical explanation for all of this. But the words on the paper kept coming back, replaying in my mind over and over again. You can't escape. I opened my eyes again, forcing myself to focus. I needed to know what was going on, what was happening in this house. I had to understand why I was feeling this way, why the walls seemed to shift, why every corner felt wrong. I turned and glanced at the door, hoping for a sense of normalcy, but the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch, creeping into the room like something alive. I could almost hear them, faint whispers just beyond my hearing. Were they real? Or was my mind starting to play tricks on me? I shook my head, trying to clear it. There was no time to think about that now. I needed to get out, to see what was happening outside, to remind myself that the world was still real, that I wasn't losing my mind. But as I moved toward the door, I felt something heavy settle in my chest, a weight that made every step feel like a struggle. Just before I opened the door, I stopped. The house seemed to be waiting for me to make a decision. I could feel it in the air. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the anticipation. The sense that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. I couldn't stay in here any longer. I reached for the door handle and pulled it open. The moment I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like a splash of cold water. It was a relief, almost as if the world outside could reset whatever had begun to unravel inside me. The night was quiet, peaceful, with the soft hum of the distant city behind me. For a moment, I thought I could forget the letter, the strange feeling, and just breathe. But then I heard it. A sound. A faint tapping. Coming from behind me. I turned quickly, my heart leaping in my chest. There was nothing there, just the dimly lit porch and the empty street beyond. I stepped back, uncertain, my eyes darting from side to side. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered. I tried to push the fear aside. It was just the wind, I told myself. Maybe the old house was just settling. Maybe it was just the sound of the streetlights flickering on. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something was wrong. Something was watching. I glanced at the house behind me, its windows dark. It felt different now. More imposing, somehow. More alive. And the thought that had been creeping at the back of my mind since I found the letter now surfaced in full force. What if the house itself is trying to tell me something? I couldn't stay outside much longer. I needed answers. I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if there was something truly wrong. With my heart pounding, I turned and walked back toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard a faint, barely audible sound, a whisper, maybe coming from inside the house. I froze. It wasn't my imagination. The whisper was real. And then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Coming from upstairs. My body was frozen, every muscle tense, but my mind was racing. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost as if someone, or something, was moving deliberately upstairs, trying to make sure I heard it. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of there. But my feet stayed rooted to the spot, as if the house itself had somehow claimed me. I hesitated, glancing back at the door. I could still leave. The night was calm outside, the streets empty and waiting, a world of possibilities stretching before me. But no! My mind wouldn't let me. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. The footsteps continued, each step coming closer, though I knew no one could have been up there. I hadn't heard a door open, no sign of life in the house. Yet, there was something undeniable in the sound, a weight to each footfall that made the walls seem to shudder in response. I felt my chest tighten, my breath shallow. I wasn't just hearing things. Something was in the house. Something was moving. And it wasn't me. I turned back to the door, bracing myself. Should I go upstairs? Should I confront whatever was up there? No, I couldn't. But then the thought struck me. The letter. You can't escape. Was that it? Was I trapped here now, caught in some kind of loop? The footsteps paused. The silence grew thick, heavier than it had ever been before. Then, a soft sound, like a creak, came from above, and then another. A door opening. A voice, barely a whisper, drifted down from the second floor. Come upstairs. My blood ran cold. I didn't hear it as much as I felt it, an invitation, a command, a force that pulled at me from the inside. It was too clear. Too real. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear myself out of this nightmare, but my body was trapped. My legs wouldn't listen. I just stood there, staring at the stairs leading up into the darkness. The air in the hallway grew colder, thicker, and I knew that whatever had spoken wasn't something I could avoid. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. Come upstairs. Now. It wasn't a choice anymore. The house wasn't asking, it was ordering. The weight of it pressed down on me, and before I could think, I was moving. Each step felt unnatural, as if I were being dragged forward, unwilling, but unable to stop. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, the darkness above swallowing the light from below. The silence was deafening, and every inch of the space around me seemed to expand, closing in, stretching out in ways that didn't make sense. I could barely breathe, my chest tight, my throat dry. Every step felt like it might be my last. When I reached the top, I found myself standing at the threshold of the hallway. The familiar warmth of the living room below me was gone. The house above me was cold, empty, like something forgotten. The air was thick, stagnant, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I turned to look down the hallway. The doors of the rooms on either side were closed, but I could sense someone, behind them. I couldn't explain how, but it was like there was something inside, waiting for me to open the door. I almost reached for the nearest handle, but then I stopped. I couldn't. Not yet. My mind raced with questions. What was happening? Was it all in my head? Or was the house alive? Alive in a way that no one had ever imagined? And what about the letter? Was that just a trick, some kind of warning? I turned back toward the stairwell, but as I did, I saw something that made my heart stop in my chest. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure. I couldn't see it clearly, just a silhouette, its features hidden in shadow. But I knew it was watching me. Waiting. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, unmoving, as though it had been there all along, waiting for me to notice. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't listen. I could only stand there, feeling my breath catch in my throat, the cold air of the upstairs room pressing against my skin like ice. I finally gathered the strength to whisper, my voice trembling, "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, still as death itself, its presence filling the hallway, suffocating me. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, just a thought, a whisper inside my head, I heard it. The words that chilled me to my core. "You know me." And before I could react, the figure moved. Slowly. Deliberately. One step. Then another. I wasn't alone. The figure moved closer, each step deliberate, measured. My heart raced, and panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to lift, and yet too tense to stand still. The silence between us was thick, oppressive, but I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, as though it could see right through me. "You know me." The words echoed in my mind, their coldness sending chills down my spine. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. I wanted to run, to find a way out of this nightmare, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in front of me. There was something familiar about it, but the more I tried to place it, the more it slipped away, like a memory just out of reach. Every fiber of my being screamed that I should be afraid, but there was also something else, a whisper of recognition, of understanding. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "Who are you?" I managed to force the words out. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it took another step, its movements as fluid and unnatural as shadows stretching across the walls. I could see it more clearly now, or at least I thought I could. The shape was tall, indistinct, like a person, but not quite. It flickered, shifting in and out of focus, as though it didn't belong to the same reality I did. "Open the door," it whispered. My breath caught in my throat. The door, was it talking about the room in front of me? The one that seemed to be calling me from the darkness? I didn't know if I could open it. I didn't even know if I should. But the figure seemed to be waiting, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. The voice in my mind grew louder, sharper. "You've been here before." The words didn't make sense at first, but then I remembered. The letters. The ones I had written to my friend. The ones I had sent. No, the ones I thought I had sent. My hands began to shake as I realized what was happening. The door. The one the figure was pointing to, it wasn't just a door. It was the door. The one I had written about in the letters. The one I had described in detail, as though I had been there before. As though I knew what was behind it. I turned my head slowly, my body fighting against the urge to flee. The hallway was suffocatingly still, but the closer I got to the door, the louder my heartbeat grew in my ears. I could almost hear it, something behind the door, something waiting, watching, expecting me. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling as it brushed against the cold wood. It felt wrong, too smooth, too alive, like it was pulsing with energy I couldn't understand. And then, a sudden jolt of realization hit me. The door wasn't just waiting for me. It had been waiting for me the entire time. The room on the other side, the one I had been trying to avoid, wasn't just a place. It was a memory. A place I had been before, but only in some twisted reflection of reality. The house had known I would come. It had been pulling me closer all this time. I was trapped. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stood there, my hand frozen on the door's handle, my thoughts scattered. The figure was still there, standing motionless in the hallway, watching me, waiting. The silence pressed down on me like a vice. The figure's voice came again, this time stronger. "Open it." With a sudden surge of fear, I twisted the handle, pushing the door open just enough to step inside. My mind screamed for me to stop, to turn back, but my feet carried me forward, too numb to protest. The room beyond was as cold as I had imagined, but it was also familiar in ways that sent an icy shiver down my spine. The walls were lined with photographs, my photographs. But they weren't pictures I had taken. They were pictures of me, in moments I couldn't remember, in places I'd never been. Some were recent, others from long ago. But they all showed the same thing, me, watching. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the room didn't let me go. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, locking me inside. My pulse raced as the photographs seemed to shift, the eyes in them following me, turning to face me wherever I moved. And then, I heard it. A voice, soft and chilling, coming from the darkness at the back of the room. "You never left." It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. But it was familiar, deep and distant, as if it had been waiting for me to understand the truth. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor. My hands trembled as they grasped at the floorboards, but they felt wrong, too soft, too alive. The house was alive. The photographs were alive. And I had been part of it all along. The door behind me rattled as if something was trying to break through, but I was no longer sure what was real. Was I trapped in this room? Or had I always been here, bound to it by something I couldn't escape? The figure in the hallway, the voice that had followed me, the house, it was all one thing, one unyielding truth. The letter had never been a warning. It had been a reality. I was never meant to leave. And now, there was no way out. The last thing I heard before everything went black was a final whisper in my mind, a thought that felt like it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. "You were never meant to write the letter." Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.